Hi, Vinnitsa. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you. It's a short story. The conference is very long, and I don't like leaving my wife, who's not very well, for too long these days. So you've got an electronic version of me. I was listening to Henry Redhead the other day, and I suddenly realised instead of calling this talk Another Way is Possible, I ought to call it Sneaking a Slice of Summerhill into a State Secondary School. Anyway, I'm going to talk about what is wrong with most of our schools and school systems, and then what democratic education can contribute to improving things so that we can face the challenges presented by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I will refer to my own experiences as a teacher and inspector in England. Now, I apologise for being old, tired, and worst of all, male with grey hair. Don't know about the size of the ego. I think that's shrinking along with all the other bits. But now's your chance to escape for a coffee, especially if you've already heard this talk once in Kiev, because I'm afraid it's a bit of a repeat performance. Well, what's wrong with what we have now? I think the English philosopher Bertrand Russell and the American philosopher John Dewey were correct when they said that conventional authoritarian schools offer the choice of becoming either submissive or rebellious, and that neither provides a good preparation for living in a democracy or for taking responsibility for your own life. The same idea is expressed in the 2016 policy document of the Ukrainian Ministry of Education, entitled The New Ukraine School. It lists the qualities required by young people today and tomorrow, all of which I agree with: creativity, critical thinking, goal setting, teamwork, communication. It powerfully describes the failure of your existing school system to generate these skills. At present, your document says most skills just stuff kids' heads with more and more out-of-date information and then test their memorization of it, thereby generating maximum anxiety, mental ill health, damaged well-being, none of which is conducive to deep and meaningful learning. This sounds familiar, just like England. The Ukrainian document creates an unforgettable metaphor in describing a typical Ukrainian school student as being like a stuffed fish. It looks like a fish, but it can't swim. I guess that we're here today because we agree with this point of view, to some extent anyway. To reinforce the point, I want to repeat a few words from a brilliant piece of writing that won this year's Scottish Schools Young Writer of the Year award. Written by a 16-year-old called Harriet Sweetman, it speaks for millions of British and probably Ukrainian young people trapped in our anxiety-ridden, testing-obsessed, PISA-performance-driven day prisons that we call schools. She writes, "We are told that if we are not fit to work, then we are worthless. There is no love in learning anymore. We envy the people who've left school already. Whatever happened to expanding your horizons? Assignments where you can research what you want count for nothing. Finding out who I am and what I care about is unimportant. I've been flattened by a concrete curriculum, so structured and unforgiving that I've forgotten how to function without it. With no bell throbbing at even intervals and no grading to build our lives around, how will we cope? They say that high school is the best years of your life, but not in this world, where qualifications matter more than personal qualities. I feel that I've grown backwards," she says, "as if I know less about myself and who and what I could be than when I started. The curriculum must release its chokehold on the throats of this nation's children and let them breathe. But for us, it's too late. For now, we just have to wait until the final bell rings and we walk out of the school door forever." Well, hear, hear, Harriet. 20 years ago at a Council of Europe conference on how to teach democracy and human rights, I said that learning about democracy and human rights when I was at school was like reading holiday brochures in prison. I also said that you can't learn to swim if you're not allowed into the water. Democracy and respect for human rights require skills as well as understanding. They have to be practiced in the everyday life of the school and not just talked about by teachers. According to Harriet, not much has changed since I was at school. In my experience, young people need time and space to discover themselves, to find their interests and passions, to learn from each other, to create their own identities. In our schools, we don't allow this, and we even pursue our students into their homes with homework. This is why Yakov Hecht and I are demanding that at least one day per week in all schools should be immediately negotiated around the interests and questions of the students. We call it the 20% campaign. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? The state still has 80%. The other way that I found both necessary and possible as a teacher could be described as democratic education. What do I mean by democratic education? Well, basically I mean two things. The first I call SPDM, student participation in decision making, choosing what and how they will learn. The second I call SPDDM, student participation in democratic decision making, about how the class and the school community will be managed democratically and with respect for human rights. These school communities of learning and decision making should not be too large, maybe 150, 200 maximum, the number that can attend a school meeting and know who everybody else is. In my experience, even large schools can be broken down to schools within schools. These in turn should be made up of groups of perhaps 20 or 30 maximum where it's possible for everybody to speak. Well, both these kinds of decision making are needed for young people to discover their own purposes and to be able to create their own identities. This is already important and will become more so as the fourth industrial revolution unfolds. Its artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning threatens the capacity of work, or rather full-time paid employment, to provide security of identity for most of us, as much of this paid employment will cease to exist over the coming years. Only a few % of people, perhaps, will be required or know how to create and develop the high-tech world that is advancing like a tsunami. The rest of us, supported by some form of universal basic income, trialled with success in Canada and Finland, will need to be able to create our own identities for ourselves. It could provide us with time to enrich our own lives and the quality of our democracies. Schooling as we know it doesn't help young people prepare for this. We need another kind of school, where young people can discover and develop in freedom their own talents, purposes and passions, and at the same time learn to manage democratic societies which respect human rights. Coercive, authoritarian schools do not and cannot do this. Some small private democratic schools like Summerhill or Sudbury Valley provide us with models, pioneers of possibility I call them. These fully democratic schools share certain features, though no two are quite the same. Those of us working with the majority of young people in our state school systems will have to be more fox-like and opportunist than those who work in democratic schools. The new Ukraine school document refers to schools needing to become places that no longer reproduce the poverty ladder, but instead leverage social equality, consolidate communities of creative and responsible citizens who are active and enterprising. This is all great, but why is there no mention of democracy or human rights? I'm puzzled by these omissions and hope to discuss them with you later in the conference. The task of creating necessary change is not easy. It will be a struggle to change the stuffed fish schools. It will cause anxieties for teachers and uncertainties for parents and students. We have to be supreme opportunists. How we do it will depend on how we can adapt the two key principles of curriculum choice and democratic learning communities to the realities in which we find ourselves. Some school students are already demanding changes to the school curriculum. Not all young people are as depressed as Harriet Sweetman. OBESU, the Organising Bureau of European School Student Unions, has been arguing for change for 40 years, but with little effect. They have been waiting for a uniting issue, such as the overwhelming imperative of resisting climate change. I'm very excited by the Greta Thunberg phenomenon, where demand for school change is indeed being driven by the students themselves, led by the courageous 16-year-old from Sweden and now spread to 36 countries at the last count. I'm sure that you've all heard of her school strike climate movement. I joined 1,500 young people in my hometown of Brighton a few weeks ago. Many of the young strikers that I spoke to knew more about climate change than their teachers, parents or politicians. In the UK, 200 academic experts in the field have backed the students in the press. In Germany, Angela Merkel has contradicted German education officials to support the students, as has Leo Varadkar in Ireland. In the UK, the government and most head teachers threatened the students with punishment. That won't stop more young people participating each week in hundreds of towns and cities worldwide, though. Is this happening in Ukraine yet? School change is also being driven by parents in many countries. For example, the first Sudbury school in England, on whose board I'm proud to sit, and many similar schools across Europe and the world, 35 new schools in France alone, perhaps 1,000 democratic schools worldwide. My own story is one of opportunism, communication and learning to find friends, to create change at the teacher level, first as a class teacher, then as senior teacher, and then as a school vice principal and acting principal. Well, why did I bother to look for another way? To improve learning, to open minds, to think for yourself, to develop curiosity and collaboration, to respect diversity, to see through the violent snake oil of demagogues and xenophobes, encouraging us to look for scapegoats for social and economic difficulties. My ideas were grounded in a long tradition of progressive child-centred education in England, though this is substantially ignored in our current teacher education. It's encouraging to find some of these ideas in the new Ukraine school and other documents that IRA has sent me. The idea that curriculum and learning should be a partnership between pupils, teachers and parents, that teachers and pupils should relate as friends without fear, and logically that means reducing coercion, straight from the A.S. Neill's Summerhill Songbook. In my first post as a young teacher, I was able to bring about change at class level and then at school level. I trained as a primary school teacher because I liked the idea of being able to create an integrated curriculum which would take into account the interests of the children. But I couldn't find a school with a vacancy. I found a secondary modern school with a progressive head teacher. Secondary modern schools exist in England in those parts of the country that test children at the age of 11 to decide which 20% should go to the grammar school or gymnasium for the academic conveyor belt to university, and then which should not. For aspiring middle-class parents and their children, failure was a catastrophe and destroyed self-confidence. In order to attempt to repair this damage, my job was to teach all the humanities subjects to one class of 35 of these failure kids, which made me responsible for about 65% of their curriculum. At our first meeting on my first day as a teacher, I arranged the chairs in a circle. Although all the subjects concerned had given me a prescribed curriculum, with the tacit approval of the head teacher, I ignored all that stuff. The head teacher wanted me to experiment with the creation of an integrated curriculum. What he didn't expect was for me to do this with the children making the decisions. I sat in the circle and introduced myself. I explained that history was about the past, geography was about different places and the people who lived there, religious knowledge was about what people believed, social studies was how people lived together, and English was about how people communicated. I explained that anyone could ask questions and discuss what I'd said, but please only speak when you're holding the special book. One boy immediately said, "Oh, I think that covers everything in the world." "Does that mean we can learn about anything we want to in the whole world?" "Well, I suppose it does," I replied, making sure I was holding the book before speaking. And so it began. Individuals and groups began projects on a wide range of topics. The special book was replaced by an elected class chairperson. Our lessons were on 5 mornings per week and 1 whole day, Friday. We agreed by majority vote to have a short class meeting at the start of every day, with a longer meeting on Friday afternoons. The need for a class secretary quickly emerged to keep a record of decisions made at the meetings. Gradually, many jobs were created, and during the 2 years we were together, everybody in the class did more than one. Projects could last as long as they lasted, but it became a rule that when a project was finished, the owner would give a short lesson to the rest of the class and make a display that would appear in the class newspaper. The newspaper began as the back wall of our classroom, but quickly grew to cover doors, cupboards, windows, any other space available. There were many sections, each with its own editor. I said that I wanted to be the class teacher, helping everyone with their learning, and although I could also be the class policeman if I had to be, I would rather not be. It was soon obvious that to manage such a hive of activities, some rules would be needed. These were discussed and voted upon at Friday meetings. I used these discussions to introduce ideas such as the rule of law, democracy, 1 person, 1 vote, minority rights, etc. Many class laws were created. Some I agreed with, others I thought were silly, but almost always I accepted the decision of the meeting unless it broke the school rules or the laws of England. Of course, when you have laws, you have to decide what to do when they are broken. This led to the creation of the class court, with elected magistrates and a class jury. Some of the laws I would never have thought of in a million years, such as the 5 minutes quiet law. If 5 people found the room too noisy, they would put their hands up and an elected class timekeeper would call for 5 minutes quiet. If anyone spoke during these minutes, their name would be noted by the class bookkeeper, and they would appear before the next Friday court if they were noted 5 times or more in a week. Many laws were created, and the system worked brilliantly. I was afraid that when the head teacher found out what I was doing, I would be fired. On the contrary, because several parents noticed the transformation of confidence in their children, they began to inform him how happy they were with my methods. Head teachers love to hear good news from parents. He was a bit worried that I wasn't doing much formal teaching, though, and as there were 6 other parallel classes working in a more formal way than I was, he decided to give all the classes a test. I was embarrassed when my class scored more highly than the others, but he was relieved and let me continue on my own way. This, of course, created some challenges with my colleagues, whose students began to ask why they didn't have class meetings in a class court. I realised I needed to explain what I was doing to the rest of my team. They were mostly young, but all had more experience than me, and it's to their credit that far from treating me as a lunatic, they also began to try some of my ideas. After the first year, instead of being fired, I was put in charge of all 7 classes as they moved up to what is our Year 8 in England. We introduced the democratic approach to the whole year group of 200 plus students. An elected year council was created to organise inter-class sports, quizzes, discos, parties, trips, etc. The whole teaching team were volunteers, which was great and included some fresh from college. Relations with the heads of subjects, who realised that they were losing control of their part of the curriculum, became more difficult, however, and I had to learn some political lessons, which were useful when I moved to more senior posts. I'm still in touch with some of these 60-year-old kids who were in my first class for those 2 years, 1969 to 71, and they've helped me write a book about the experience. You're welcome to a copy if you just email me. Several went on to university despite their initial academic failure. All remember with pride our co-created class democracy and freely chosen curriculum. All say it changed their sense of failure and helped them to believe in themselves again. All say it helped them create a strong sense of purpose and identity which has stayed with them. One actually became a head teacher himself with a strong belief in student voice. We've shared some vivid memories, a few of which I'll mention here if time allows. For example, the day the head teacher brought visitors to the class when I was not in the room, but the class was working quietly without a teacher. Andrew explained that our teacher is a bit soft, so we have class government and laws, and if we didn't, it would be chaos in here. All the time we were visited by a national newspaper and I forgot to get the head teacher's permission. All the time the class gave lectures on class democracy at the local teachers' college. All the time the class defended one of its ethnic minority members who was going to be excluded from the school for stealing. My 2 years at the school ended with the creation of a school council for the whole school of 1,500 students. Next, I'll just say a little bit about creation of a community school, where democratic change at community level was brought about, where school and community became turned on to themselves and each other through democratic structures and processes growing out of the school. In my case, this began as a bet between myself as vice principal and some older students of a rural school serving a country town supporting stone quarries and sheep farms. They found the town boring and said there were only about 20 clubs and societies with few open to young people. I bet them there were at least twice as many. They conducted a survey. They found over 100 organisations. The Students' Council and the Parents' Association invited them all to a massive conference in the school to explore how the clubs and societies could be more available to young people and how the resources of the school could be more available to the clubs and societies. The results were amazing and led to many new organisations, such as a community newspaper run by children and adults together, a community orchestra with all ages playing together. Both these organisations still exist 40 years later. All the activity was and still is managed by and coordinated by a community education council, always chaired by a school student. We went on to help create an English Community Education Association to create change at national level. After this, I became a school inspector. Not my best career move, as I didn't like much of what I saw, but I was able to encourage creative practice wherever I found it, even though on the whole national policy was pushing in the opposite direction. More and more testing and all the other anxiety-generating, uncreative nonsense that we're all too familiar with. But it gave me the opportunity to help to defend the most famous English pioneer of possibility, A.S. Neil's Summerhill School, which in 1999 was threatened with closure by the then Chief Inspector. It was the only case where a threatened school has defended itself against inspectors in court and won. It was the high point of my career as an inspector, though it didn't make me very popular with the Chief Inspector, who shortly afterwards was forced to resign. Henry Redhead has told you about this and will tell you a lot more, I'm sure. I will conclude by mentioning some examples of where opportunism made it possible to change policy at city and national school level in England. 15 years ago, with a team from the University of Sussex, we created student councils in all the secondary schools of Portsmouth, a deprived city in the affluent south with poor and declining academic performance. These councils met together and formed COPs, the City of Portsmouth students. This has now evolved over 15 years into a not-for-profit company called Unlock, which employs 10 young people and provides training in student participation across the south of England. A colleague who was at the first COPs meeting with me is today in Rwanda spreading the work of Unlock in Africa. Another example of opportunistic change, this time at national level. By chance in 2001, I found myself as an advisor to the Minister's advisor for the creation of a democratic citizenship curriculum for English schools. Put simply, I argued that if you want students to learn about democracy and human rights, you have to practice them in school and not just talk about them for tests. The Minister agreed, but he was attacked by the Chief Inspector and the right-wing press for threatening to lower standards while kids wasted time in democratic meetings. I was asked to carry out some research to see if schools that were already trying to be more democratic had worse or better academic results because of this practice. I found 20 out of 3,500 English secondary schools that had created many different ways to involve students in decisions around their learning and the management of their schools. My findings were encouraging. Schools that were more democratic than most actually had better examination results, better attendance, and fewer exclusions for antisocial behaviour when compared with the average for schools in similar socio-economic environments. This became known as the Hannam Report. It's still available online and in several languages, though not yet Ukrainian. Perhaps that's a job for somebody, Yashia. Anyway, the planned curriculum changes went ahead, though they've since been undone by recent Conservative ministers. We need much more of this research. Good work is being done, such as the enormous meta-review of Mager and Novak at Innsbruck University, which I'll happily share with anybody who wants it. Work in Denmark is demonstrating causality and not just associations and correlations between participation and outcomes. They're actually tracing the life changes of individual children. Later I had the opportunity to persuade another minister to change the law to enable students to sit as members of school boards in England. Research shows that schools who implement the opportunity have better governance as a result of listening to the students, though unfortunately it hasn't happened in many schools. Finally, I should just mention that there are exciting projects beginning in several countries as well as Ukraine. The Sympraxis project in Greece is a good example, and great ideas are emerging in Finland, New Zealand and Singapore. The Council of Europe, through its Norwegian Wergeland Centre, is doing good work with the new Ukrainian schools right here in Kiev. Are any of you from these schools? I'd love to hear your side of the story, and perhaps we could chat afterwards. I should have said Vinnitsa, shouldn't I, not Kiev? But I think most of these schools are in the Kiev area. Yakov Hecht, I'm sure, has told you about the great work in Israel. Perhaps the most important thing I've learned is the importance of not being alone. I think our potential power is something like the mathematical square of the size of group of like-minded people. As the song says, "One is one and all alone, and evermore shall be so." When we are 2, we have the strength of 4. When we are 3, the strength of 9, etc. Find some friends, choose them carefully, and then study the behaviour of the fox. There is always something that can be done. And unlike teachers in my country, you have a government policy framework that wants you to be innovative to create a new and a better way. We must resist the dystopian Orwellian future that the Belarusian writer Evgeny Morozov describes as digital feudalism. In this version of the future, elites will be able to use artificial intelligence to extend and maintain their wealth and position in alliance with authoritarian states, and with the right algorithms, they will keep tighter and tighter control over our innermost thoughts and behaviours. A fear of these ideas, held by Xi Jinping in China, is driving the young people onto the streets of Hong Kong right now. You could almost see our current authoritarian school systems as perfect preparation for this future. I believe that another way is possible. If we succeed, we can make creative use of the immense increases in productivity and free time offered by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We can adopt the ideas of the circular and sharing economies to create more equitable, humanly fulfilling and environmentally sustainable societies that are grounded in democracy and human rights. We can use the productivity of artificial intelligence rather than be used by it. We can delay singularity forever. You can look that one up if you don't know what it is. We can focus on things like empathy, which it cannot emulate. Democratic education can and will help us to achieve this. I think we really have no choice. I have to be an optimist despite my age. I have 7 grandchildren. We need not just the new Ukrainian school, but the new European school, the new international school, a new kind of school for planet Earth. Nothing is more important. Thank you for listening.